Welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled you're joining us today. We are going to tackle a fascinating and honestly a pretty complex topic, the intersection of passionate theology and objective history. Have you ever found yourself in one of those tense conversations with a friend or family member who is just deeply entrenched in their theological views, and you're sitting there completely unsure of how to invite them to consider historical facts in a more objective way? It's a tricky dance, right? Well, today we're going to dive into our source material to explore exactly why that resistance exists and, more importantly, how we can constructively bridge that gap between deeply held beliefs and historical evidence. Let's get into it.
Okay, there's a really powerful baseline we need to establish right out of the gate. Truth isn't afraid of questions. It's actually better understood because of them. Think about it. Logically, truth should never fear critical inquiry. In fact, you'd think that the bigger the historical or spiritual claim being made, the more rigorous the verification process ought to be. Yet, as our sources point out, we often see a massive resistance to questioning within religious circles. Instead of this open, rigorous examination, questions are met with a defensive wall. So why does that happen? That is exactly what we're going to unpack.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. First, the fear of questions. Second, theology versus history. Third, the psychological barriers. Fourth, the a priori problem. Fifth, frameworks for dialogue. And finally, bridging faith and facts. Starting with Section 1, the fear of questions, or suppressing the unknown. Our source material highlights this deeply ingrained culture in many communities where simply expressing uncertainty is viewed as totally undermining your credibility. Imagine being a pastor or, say, a theology professor who has just spent years studying ancient Greek or Hebrew. You start to notice these profound linguistic nuances, like how New Testament authors adapted original Hebrew meanings to fit a Greek context, but you feel completely unable to voice those questions openly. The internal conflict there is massive. Silence just becomes this protective shield. It's perceived as a much safer alternative to casting doubt on your own faith or, accidentally unraveling the faith of your entire congregation. So, how does this suppression actually play out? Well, there's often this implicit rule against challenging established leaders. People are terrified of being labeled a doubter, or worse, a heretic. That is a seriously heavy, loaded word, and the fear of that label can be incredibly isolating, especially if your views start to wander from your specific denomination's orthodoxy. So what happens? Well-meaning people just push the questions down. They hope those doubts will magically fade away on their own, which leads to a pretty superficial acceptance of whatever doctrines are handed to them. But here is the kicker. These questions don't just vanish. They accumulate. And when a culture sidelines intellectual honesty just to keep the peace, it builds a massive roadblock to any kind of objective dialogue. Section 2. Theology versus history. Looking through two very different lenses. We absolutely have to understand that part of this conflict comes from looking at the exact same subject through two entirely different lenses. On one hand, you have the historical Jesus. This lens demands facts, linguistic context, and verifiable dates. For example, our sources note conflicting biblical accounts of his birth. Was it 4 BCE under King Herod, or was it 6 CE during the Roman census under Quirinius? Now that might sound like a tiny detail, but that is a 10-year gap. It completely alters the historical and socio-political timeline. Plus, there are literally zero contemporary Roman or Jewish records of Jesus from his actual lifetime. Now flip to the other hand, the theological Jesus. This is built entirely on faith, church tradition, and theological reflection. For believers, this Jesus is 100% real in the mind and spirit, and that reality simply doesn't require empirical historical evidence. Hebrews 11:1 literally defines faith as the evidence of things not seen. The friction happens because believers prioritize that theological view and naturally kind of blur the two together, treating spiritual theology as if it were objective history. We actually see this dual lens in how ancient texts are read too. Mainstream historians use something called peshat, which is the strict historical grammatical context of the era. Think of peshat like reading a dry, precise documentary transcript. Every single word means exactly what it meant the day it was spoken. But the New Testament authors and the church traditions that followed often operated using pesher. This is a Christocentric theological reading that puts a deeper, spiritual reality way above the original historical setting. Think of pesher more like reading a complex, beautiful poem where words symbolize a hidden truth pointing to a specific conclusion. Grasping this difference is an absolute game changer. When objective facts clash with biblical narratives, it's very often because those original authors were writing rich theology, not a modern history textbook. Section 3. The psychological barriers. Why facts face such strong resistance. The sources identify a very specific psychological architecture that blocks objective analysis. First up is biblical inerrancy. This is the deeply held assumption that the text is divinely protected from any historical or human flaw whatsoever. If someone genuinely believes the book is flawless, then any academic finding of a discrepancy is naturally going to feel like a direct attack, and that leads straight into the fear of deconstruction. For a lot of people, accepting late datings of texts or anonymous authorship feels like a literal threat to their personal salvation. Then we have pulpit focus and isolation from scholarship. Because weekend sermons are built for spiritual encouragement, not academic critique, many incredibly well-meaning people just haven't been exposed to the socio-political realities of the first century. When we try to introduce objective facts, we have to maintain a deep, genuine empathy for these barriers.
Which brings us to Section 4, the a priori problem, or the assumption of settled truth. So, what exactly is the a priori problem? Simply put, it's the widespread assumption among believers that all theological truth has already been completely settled by church leaders. Over the last 2,000 years, through countless councils, creeds, and traditions, these views were cemented in place. This can make modern believers feel like all the heavy intellectual lifting has already been done. The mindset is basically, hey, the experts already figured this out, so there's nothing left to ask. This fundamentally shuts down critical inquiry. It assumes there's nothing new to discover, and anybody bringing up historical or linguistic facts is just, stirring up unnecessary trouble.
But here's the thing. This creates a massive logical paradox, perfectly captured by this quote from our sources. If each denomination claims to be the correct interpretation, how can they all be right? The Christian landscape is fragmented into tens of thousands of denominations, and so many of them assert that their specific tradition is the only correct one. Logically speaking, either one is right or they all have flaws. Now, pointing out this simple paradox isn't about backing someone into a corner or winning an argument. Instead, it's just a gentle way to demonstrate that actually there is still room for questioning, creating just a tiny crack in the door for some objective curiosity. Section 5, Frameworks for Dialogue. Let's look at some actual tools for constructive conversations. If you want to invite objective dialogue, you really have to speak their language. To do this, you can lean on frameworks provided by prominent biblical scholars from different traditions. Think of this as a bit of a cheat sheet. If you're talking with an evangelical, casually bringing up N.T. Wright can be a game changer. Wright uses this framework called critical realism, arguing that rigorous, secular historical methods actually confirm the core claims of faith, so they don't have to be terrified of history. If you're chatting with a Catholic, you can point to Raymond Brown. He taught that the human authors of the Bible definitely made historical errors, but the overarching theology remains totally inspired by tradition. And for progressive or reformed folks, Peter Enns offers the incarnational model, arguing that the Bible is just a wonderfully messy human book that reflects its ancient times. You can use these specific frameworks to introduce history in a way that totally disarms those defensive barriers we talked about earlier. Section 6, Bridging Faith and Facts. How to actually invite objective inquiry. When you approach someone who is fiercely passionate about their theology, your goal is not to destroy their faith. Let me say that again. Your goal is absolutely not to destroy their faith. Your goal is simply to introduce the historical grammatical method as a complementary lens. You validate their theological reading, for sure, but you invite them to see that looking at the historical and linguistic context doesn't erase the text's value. It just adds high-definition context to a worldview they already hold. You are taking the posture of a fellow learner. You're offering them a wider view, not snatching anything away from their deeply held beliefs. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is help people shift from a knee-jerk defensive reaction over to a posture of critical assessment. As the sources remind us, truth has to be rigorously examined. There is zero dishonor in taking the time to explore the things we don't fully understand. A really robust understanding requires us to engage our intellect, to verify facts, and to blend our traditions with historical reality. It is entirely about enriching our understanding, not compromising it. Which leaves us with this final, vital question to ponder. When we read ancient texts, or when we discuss our most passionate beliefs with others, are we genuinely seeking historical truth, or are we just protecting our theological comfort? Remember, truth isn't afraid of questions, and neither should we be. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, keep looking at the facts, and I will see you next time.